The Wisdom of the Echo by Emmett Swan. A trail of yellow dust followed Mackie into the mercantile. Behind the counter, an elderly clerk stood and wiped the grime from his dark lenses. "Hey, old-timer," Mackie said, as he handed the clerk a list. The old man glanced at it and studied Mackie. "You're the guy living beyond the boundary, out past Broken Mesa?" "Yep, that's me." The old man nodded. "It's been a while." He began entering the items on the list into his computer. His thin, gnarled hands, covered in age spots, moved slowly, but with practiced confidence. "Living in the yonder by yourself," he said, shaking his head. "It's risky." "I'm not by myself." The clerk stopped pressing keys and stared at Mackie, his forehead furrowed. "But I heard—" "They did, but I keep their remains with me. For company." The old man blinked, but said nothing. He pursed his lips and returned to his keyboard. "Hasn't been tested out there," he said quietly. "Could be toxic." Mackie shrugged. "I'm past caring. If it kills me, it kills me. Anyway, I like it out there. It's quiet. No people around." The clerk stepped among the back shelves and collected Mackie's items, set them on a tarp, and wrapped them into a neat bundle with plastic twine. "Just deduct what I owe you from my allocation," said Mackie. "Stern is the name. Mackie Stern." "Will do." The clerk set the bundle on top of the counter. "Thanks for coming by." Mackie nodded, but didn't pick up his items right away. He fiddled with the twine and looked up at the clerk. "I take it you've been here a while?" "They opened Corbin for settlement in 2244. I planted my skinny ass here in 51. Not many transports got here before mine." "Have you heard of a talking animal living on this planet?" The clerk took off his dark glasses and peered at Mackie. "A talking animal?" "Yeah, that's right. It was standing in my grove of turlipod trees. I could have sworn it spoke before it ran off." "Did it have blonde fur and stand about this high?" asked the clerk, putting his hand level with his chest. "Yes. It kinda looked like a small horse, though its neck was too narrow." "You saw a tuyo," chuckled the clerk. "They don't really talk. They just mimic. Must have heard something you said." "I'll be damned." "I've never seen one before." "Well, they're pretty rare. Skittish, too. You may never see it again." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. On the street outside the mercantile, Mackie looked around the tiny community. The dust was already getting up. He could see it swirling between the prefab buildings. His ride home wouldn't be pleasant. He put his supplies in his cart, sat on his battery-powered three-wheeler, and cleaned the yellow dust from his dark glasses. In seconds, he had left the cluster of buildings behind and was rolling along at full speed. It would take him 4 hours to reach his homestead, with the last hour in the yonder, the lands beyond the settlement boundary. There were no roads out that way, but cross-country travel was manageable, since the soil was covered by a flat mat of yellow vegetation, a carpet of tangled roots and branches. It made for a fairly smooth ride, but the mat produced a fine dust that flew everywhere and made breathing difficult. The level terrain was occasionally broken by rocky mesas and small ranges of hills, and dotted here and there were waterholes surrounded by islands of brilliant green vegetation. These always had homesteads nearby, most growing crops or raising livestock. For Mackie, the land held a kind of pristine, though sterile, beauty, and he often wondered what his family would have thought about the planet, had they ever seen it up close. Now, he kept their ashes on the top shelf of his bedroom closet. A big urn for his wife Sylvia, and 2 smaller ones for his daughters Tess and Darla. The minor sun had dipped below the horizon as he pulled up to the front of his prefab home. He parked the three-wheeler in the utility barn, unloaded his supplies, and plopped down on his wicker rocker to watch the major sun set from his front porch. A trip to the sector hub was a tiring affair. His chores would have to wait until tomorrow. Besides his home and utility barn, there were several large storage tanks installed near his barn, with stacks of plastic collection basins placed nearby. 50 meters behind his barn was a sizable waterhole, and growing around it was his pride and joy, a grove of turlipod trees. The trunk of each tree branched into hundreds of leafless limbs that stretched up and then swooped over toward the ground, terminating in a sharp point. They reminded him of willow trees with their graceful arched branches. He had planted the fast-growing trees himself when he first arrived on Corbin, hoping to make a good living producing luli wine, a unique beverage made from the urine of a tiny insects. Each branch of each turlipod tree swarmed with the reddish creatures. They ingested the sap of the tree and once every few days excreted a microdrop of raw luli. The tiny drops of converted sap, multiplied by the sheer numbers of insects, resulted in a steady drip from the tip of each branch. Collection bins placed underneath would fill with raw luli in 3 days or so. It was then merely a matter of pouring it into the storage tanks, tossing in a handful of antibacterial powder, and waiting several months. The luli fermented, creating a tasty wine that was popular on Corbin. He poured himself a glass of his own product and let out a slow sigh as the wine relaxed his road-weary muscles. The late afternoon wind had kicked up the matte dust, diffusing the light from the major sun as it crept toward the horizon, and Mackie admired the red glow that saturated the landscape. The effect was strikingly beautiful. He wished Sylvia could have been at his side to see it with him. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next morning, Mackie stepped onto his porch with a steaming cup of tea in hand. The winds usually subsided early in the day, so the matte dust had a chance to settle. He stared, half asleep, at a clear blue sky. A flash of tan-colored fur caught his eye, and he recognized the tuyo standing in his turlipod grove, its tongue lapping at the tips of the low-hanging branches. Carefully, Mackie sat down in his rocker to study the creature. It moved gracefully, but occasionally it would smack its lips, look around, and call out the word "damn," as clear as you please. Mackie was amazed and somewhat amused. Damn was his go-to curse word around the homestead whenever he whacked his finger with a hammer or matte dust jammed the machinery. There weren't many neighbors living in the yonder, so he often screamed it loud enough for the heavens to hear. "The creature is picking up my bad habits," he said, smiling to himself. "I hope its mama is okay with that." A distant roar of an engine caught Mackie's attention. The tuyo jerked up its head and ran off into the rocky hills behind the waterhole. Mackie watched the graceful creature until it disappeared, and then stepped out into the yard to get a better look. In the direction of the noise, he could see a dust cloud. Becca was early this month. He called out his own "damn" and strode to the utility barn to drag filled luli canisters to the front of the building. He was a little vexed, since several full tanks contained almost ripe luli. He could have gotten away with selling their contents too, if he had known Becca was coming early. He had stacked the last canister by the front of the barn as Becca pulled up. As usual, she was driving her tractor with a high-walled trailer towed behind. Yellow matte dust covered her face and goggles. She cut the engine and stood to stretch her lean frame. A tall woman of late middle age, her skin was tanned the color of worn leather, a symptom of many hours in the Corbin sunshine. "How's the queen of the Matt Flats?" asked Mackie. Becca arched her back, her hands on her hips. "That damn tractor is killing my back. You'd think they would have put roads out here by now. Maybe you should invest in better shocks or hover propulsion." "I wish," chuckled Becca, "or I could just hire somebody else to drive the route." She frowned at Mackie's grouping of Luley canisters and shook her head. "Mackie, I got bad news. Sector authorities are cracking down on Luley made in the Yonder. There have been problems. Some people have gotten sick." Mackie threw his hands into the air. "Sick from what?" "I've drunk it for 2 years and I'm fine. All I know is that demand is down. People are worried. Those damn bureaucrats want to regulate the trade, get their cut of the taxes." Becca nodded. "You're probably right, but it's the way of it. I can take maybe half of those canisters just to cover orders already paid for, and I don't know if I'll be back. But who knows? Demand might pick up again." "Damn!" cried Mackie. A distant damn echoed from the rocky hills. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "There's a tuyo living around here." "A tuyo? Really? Don't see those very often." Becca began picking up the canisters and loading them, one at a time, onto her trailer, strapping them into place so they wouldn't shift. "I can't believe this," said Mackie, helping with the loading. "How am I going to make a living out here?" "I don't know what to say, Mackie. You could try algae. You have enough water." "Algae? For fuel? Are you fucking kidding me? People always need more fuel. Do you know how much algae I would have to grow to make it worthwhile? I'd have to dig breeding ponds, build feeder ditches, install harvesters, and for what? A few measly credits." Becca shrugged. "A lot of work, but it's a living. Or you could just leave." Mackie looked down at this feat. "I can't leave. Gotta make this place work." Becca grabbed a water bottle from her tractor and took several hefty swigs before spitting out a long stream, stirring up a tiny cloud of dust from the dried carpet of vegetation. "Well then, algae might be in your future, unless you have spare cash for bribing the sector authorities." "If I had that kind of cash, I wouldn't be trying to scratch a living out here." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. That afternoon, Mackie sat in the shade of his porch and was halfway through his 3rd glass of Luley wine. His eyes kept wandering toward the 14 canisters full of Luley that Becca had declined, still sitting by the barn door. He had spent all of his resources setting up his homestead, buying the turlipod seedlings, transporting his buildings, and buying his equipment. Moving his setup inside the boundary wasn't an option. Earlier settlers had claimed all the water holes. He pondered asking the sector authorities to test his soil and approve his homestead, but it was a long shot. They would have to expand the boundary to include his land, which meant the administration would have to adjust taxation and even build roads. Why would they do all that for him? Besides, there was the little fact that it was technically illegal for anyone to live out past the boundary in the first place. He spotted the tuyo, standing once again among his turlipod trees and licking the tips of their branches. "Hey there, fellow," Mackie said, pleased to have company. "No need to drink that piss. It's time you tried the real thing." He walked slowly toward his barn, hoping not to scare the tuyo. But the creature darted away. Undeterred, Mackie filled a small container with Luley wine from one of the canisters he had set out for Becca and placed it in the middle of the turlipod grove. It took over an hour before the creature returned, cautiously surveying its surroundings. Mackie watched with satisfaction as it sniffed at the Luley container and began lapping the wine. The tuyo's tongue was short, however, and as it pushed its snout further into the container, it knocked it over sideways, spilling its contents. "Damn!" bleated the tuyo. It peered toward the porch. "Damn!" it repeated. "Bummer," said Mackie, "but I could see you liked it. I'll set you up." He went inside and grabbed a wide-bottomed plastic bin from his kitchen. He then set it beside one of the storage tanks, filled it up 3/4 full, and retreated to his porch. He couldn't see the tuyo, but assumed it had retreated into the hills just behind the waterhole. "That container is too heavy to carry," he called out. "If you want it, you gotta come a little closer." As he sat and waited, he finished his wine and drifted off to sleep. He awoke several hours later. The minor sun had already set, and the major sun was inching near the horizon. And there, in the shadow of the barn, stood the tuyo. This was the closest Mackie had seen it, but it was just standing there. It wasn't lapping the luli, the container was a few feet away, nor was it looking around. Something wasn't right. Mackie got up on his feet, but the tuyo didn't move. He edged toward the steps and quietly stepped down onto the mat. The tuyo remained motionless. Taking deliberate steps, Mackie approached the tuyo, watching it carefully and expecting it to bolt any second. But it didn't flinch. It merely swayed back and forth. Its head hung low, and though its eyes were open, they didn't appear to focus on anything in particular. Mackie took a peek in the container of luli and was surprised to see that over half of its contents was gone. That was a lot of luli. "You poor sod." He reached out and touched the creature, gently stroking its blonde fur. "You're as drunk as a broken-hearted sailor." The tuyo's rich fur was quite beautiful, with only a few burrs and pieces of matte vegetation tangled up in its long strands. Strangely, Mackie thought of Sylvia's golden locks. He spoke softly to the tuyo. "I guess this is my fault. Sorry about that. But you'll be fine. Just gotta sleep it off." Suddenly, the tuyo's whole body convulsed. Mackie stepped back as it vomited a sizable puddle of clear fluid. It then bent its knees and lowered itself to the ground. "That's right. Lie down and sleep it off." Still tipsy himself, he sat down beside the tuyo and leaned against the wall of the barn. He continued stroking the tuyo's prone body and speaking softly. Eventually, Mackie fell asleep again. Sometime later, he became aware of movement under his head. He sat up, now fully awake. He had fallen over and had been sleeping on the tuyo's body. The tuyo belched and began rocking its prone body back and forth. "It's okay, fellow. Take it easy." It climbed up on its 4 legs, but fell forward onto its chest and lay where it fell, breathing heavily. Mackie knelt beside it and again stroked its fur. "Take your time. Yeah, take your time," he intoned. "Take your time," bleated the tuyo. Mackie opened his eyes wide. "You know, you're one amazing creature. You said that perfectly." The tuyo snorted and struggled to its feet. It nearly fell over again, but caught itself. "Take your time," it bleated again, glanced at Mackie, and began a wobbly walk toward the hills behind the waterhole. "See ya, fellow," said Mackie. "Come back and say hello sometime." In the dim light, he watched the tuyo stride away, each successive step becoming more sure-footed, until it rounded the first hill. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next morning, Mackie was back on his front porch. During his restless night, he had tried to work out his living situation. Nothing seemed particularly promising, but there was no way in hell he would leave his homestead. He had 3 urns in the closet that had demonstrated their total commitment to the place, so he would stay for them. But could he really grow algae? Maybe he could tap into some off-planet trade route and keep making luli. But would off-worlders like luli? It didn't take long before he had poured himself a glass of wine to help lubricate his thinking. Minutes later, he saw the Tuyo round the waterhole and head toward his barn. "You're looking chipper," said Mackie, smiling at the sight of his new friend. He watched as the Tuyo, now free of concern, strode up to the storage tank where his last drink had been and sniffed around. "Unbelievable," said Mackie. "You're looking for more wine." The Tuyo swung its gaze toward Mackie. Mackie opened his palms. "Sorry, I poured it out. Didn't think you would want any more." The Tuyo strode boldly over to the porch where Mackie stood and sniffed around the steps. "Okay, fella," said Mackie. "You win." He went inside, fetched a saucepan from the cupboard, and filled it with cool luli from his refrigerated container. He carried it outside and stepped down the porch steps. The Tuyo backed off a few feet, but watched with intense interest as Mackie set the pan on the mat-covered ground. Mackie returned to his wicker rocker. "Luli," Mackie said. "Luli," repeated the Tuyo, and promptly went to investigate the container. It drank the cool contents in a matter of minutes, then looked up at Mackie. "You know what, fellow? You've got quite a drinking problem." "Luli," it bleated. Shaking his head, Mackie returned to his refrigerator, refilled the pan and his own glass, and returned to the porch. He rocked away and sipped his wine as the Tuyo lapped up its second portion, though more slowly this time around. "You're quite a handsome animal," said Mackie, admiring the Tuyo's blonde fur. The Tuyo lifted its head, bleated, "Luli," and returned to its drink. "If you and me are to be pals, you need a name. How about Jedediah?" Again, the Tuyo lifted its head, but this time bleated out "Jedediah" before returning to the luli. Mackie couldn't help smiling. "Okay, Jedediah it is. So are there more of you around here? Brothers and sisters, perhaps? I don't have anyone. I lost my family. They died on their way here." The Tuyo stopped long enough to bleat, "Sad," before continuing to lap. Mackie stared at the creature, his brow furrowed in puzzlement. He couldn't remember having uttered the word "ad" around the Tuyo. "What did you say?" The Tuyo finished the last drops of luli from the container, glanced around the landscape, then plopped itself down in the shade of the porch. It outed a long belch, licked its lips, and leered at Mackie. "I said Zad," the creature said. Mackie gawked at the Tuyo and then examined his glass of luli. Finding nothing amiss, he guzzled its contents. "Your drinking problem is worse than mine," observed Jedediah. Mackie's brain was feeling rather fuzzy. Sure, it was crazy that this creature was really talking. But the comment demanded a response. What the hell else is there to do out here? There's not a soul around for miles. And now my livelihood has just been jerked out from under my feet. It's a tough life, but you gotta keep going. Mackie bit his lip. "Yeah, I know. I mean, your family died coming here. They gave up their life for this place." Mackie slowly nodded. "So if you leave, if you give up, they would have died for nothing." Mackie looked down at his feet. "Yep, that's my thinking." He shifted his gaze up at the Tuyo. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm being a little extreme. Look, the facts are the facts. Your family is dead, so you owe it to them to make this place work. You can't leave." Mackie stared at the Tuyo for a minute, shaking his head. "You know, you're kind of a prick. A hard-headed prick." He threw down his empty metal cup and walked inside to his bed to sleep it off. It was all a goddamned hallucination anyway. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A few hours later, Mackie was roused from unconsciousness. He opened his bleary eyes to see the Tuyo standing over him. Somehow, it had gotten into his house and had made its way to the bedroom, where it had been nuzzling his cheek. "Luli!" it bleated. Mackie sat up too quickly and struck his head against the headboard. He gazed at the Tuyo. How in the hell? He had a vague and unsettling memory of the thing conversing with him. Obviously, the wine was messing with his head. Maybe he should have the soil tested after all. Up on his feet, he inched around the unmoving creature and opened his refrigerator. "Hair of the dog?" asked Jedediah, watching Mackie pour himself a glass. Mackie gaped at Jedediah. It wasn't a dream. The damn thing talks. He frowned, shook his head vigorously, and gulped the Luli. "Where's mine?" asked Jedediah. Mackie stared some more at the creature, dumbfounded. "I said, where's mine?" Jedediah repeated. Mackie let out a long sigh. "Okay, but on the porch, please." He filled the pan with wine and set it down on the porch. Then, a fresh glass of Luli in hand, he settled down into his rocker. The Tuyo lapped his portion heartily, let out a couple of belches, and directed its gaze toward Mackie. "Big day planned?" it asked. "Oh yeah, gotta sit on this porch, guzzle Luli, and contemplate algae." "Algae?" "Yeah, they make fuel from it." "Well, you gotta make a living." "Yeah, I do. And you gotta do it here. 'Cause you know." "Yes, I know, we covered this already." "'Cause they died coming here." "Yes, my family died," shouted Mackie. "It's really not necessary to keep mentioning it." He went inside the house and returned with 3 urns, setting them in a row on the porch railing. "Meet my wife Sylvia and my daughters Tess and Darla. So you see, I know they're dead." Jedediah contemplated the urns. "Don't you think it's a bit morbid that you keep those in your house?" Mackie shrugged. The Tuyo, swaying noticeably, took a sweeping glance around. "Not much of a place, is it? So what did you say to Sylvia to get them to come?" "I promised adventure, a new life. I said the land was probably safe. I mean, if it were toxic, I would know it, right? So I told her we could forge a good life here. That's not too much to ask. A loving wife should come live with you so the 2 of you could raise your family together." "Exactly. It doesn't really matter how risky the venture is." "Yeah, something like that. But they didn't make it. They were lost in the shuttle crash after you pressured them into coming." "I didn't say I pressured them, but yeah." "So you killed them." Mackie gestured toward the 3 urns. "Yep. As we can all see, they are dead." "No. What I'm saying is, if you hadn't pressured them into coming, they would be alive now." Mackie shrugged. "What's your fucking point?" "My fucking point is that it's your fucking fault. So you had better do whatever it takes to make this miserable patch of ground work, even if it takes until you are 90 years old. Do you know how crazy you sound?" "I'm crazy? You are the one having a conversation with a wild animal." Mackie stared at the Tuyo for a moment, shaking his head. "You're right. I am having a conversation with a wild animal." He plopped down in his rocker. "I should have the soil tested." "Probably. And you should grow algae pens and make it work, or you will have killed your family for nothing." "But to give up my whole life? After all, I wasn't actually piloting the shuttle. If you hadn't pressed them to come, they would be alive. That's all you need to know." Mackie frowned at the Tuyo. "You know, you are a wacko. A stubborn wacko." "I'm the wacko?" "Yep. But I'm a Tuyo. I can only mimic." Mackie nodded slowly. "Damn," he said. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Mackie approached the clerk behind the counter. As usual, the old-timer wiped the yellow grime from his dark shades, put them back on, and looked Mackie over. "Back already?" he asked. "You're pretty far in arrears." Mackie shook his head. "Don't need more supplies. I'm giving up my place." The clerk nodded. "Smart move. It's not safe out past the boundary. I've got my modular house, a utility barn, and some tanks and such for loolie production. Just take it and sell it or something. That should cover my debt." The clerk furrowed his brow. "I'll have to haul all that stuff in. But yeah, it should cover it. Thanks." The old-timer set his glasses on the counter and squinted at Mackie. "You lasted longer than most. And you still seem to have your wits after all that time in the yonder. You got nothing to be ashamed of." "Well, I don't know about my wits, but there's a bastard of a Tuyo living out there that talked some sense into me. He helped me realize I was being an idiot." "A Tuyo? But they can't talk. They just mimic. Sometimes a mimic is exactly what we need to hear." Mackie gave the old-timer a wave and stepped out into the dusty street. He took a last glance around the prefab buildings and straddled his three-wheeler. It would take him 6 hours to reach the shuttle port, and then there would be the long journey home to begin a new chapter in his life. But it would be many years before he would forget the tang of Luli wine. End.